I'd love to welcome Ron Gantt, who I've done a little bit of work before or with previously, and had a fantastic time running some hop and learning teams activities. And we're here on this How Did It Make Sense podcast. So, Ron, tell us a little bit about yourself. For those who don't know, I'm pretty sure lots of people do know you, but tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the space you're in at the moment.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm Ron. I'm a safety professional. I work at a data center company called Yondr as their HSE Director for the Americas region. But before that, I was a consultant and been doing safety for 20 some years. I'm also on the podcast Punk Rock Safety with some friends of mine, Dave Proven and Ben Goodhart, who you know.
I do. Great
Yeah.
podcast.
Mm, Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we have a good time. We try to keep it fun.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Excellent. Well, I'm really pleased that you've come on here. I've sort of looked at you and looked up at you for ages, and the ideas and the
Oh,
content you
too
bring.
kind.
Well, it's sort of credit where it's due because it's this inspiration to sit there and go, you're able to look at events with a view that, there's a bunch of us get that view, but there are many people who don't, and you bring a very passionate but not critical and not putting down view. You truly believe in this, and I think most of us do in that sense because we recognize that things aren't as they appear, and that's really what this podcast is about. So the first part of this podcast, other than the introductions piece, is about a first story. So the idea being here that you tell a story, that the sort of thing that might appear in the media, social media, or an accident report in the sort of traditional safety space. So have you got a story?
I mean, there's all kinds of stories. So I want to tell actually a story that's a bit, I don't know, more mundane. I'm always fascinated by these mundane stories that
Mhm.
people often pass by and don't think about, and are actually rather complex and interesting when you dig a little bit. So a number of years ago, I did a lot of work with a utility in the Midwest part of the United States that was over water and trash pickup.
Mhm.
And the trash pickup, the solid waste is what they call it,
Mhm.
waste pickup, who were it's just got to think my internet's unstable, so apologies if it gets bad. But anyways, so they were having lots of injuries related to strains. Guys would sometimes get cut picking up things,
Mhm.
and they just couldn't figure out what to do. And it was like, these guys are rushing. They're not taking the time to do proper lifting techniques. I mean, this is basic stuff, just picking up trash. How hard could this be?
Yeah.
Sometimes they would also, this was a part of the country that had lots of brick architecture in homes. And so these huge trash trucks, you can imagine, would accidentally bump into the brick mailboxes that are near the
All
road
right. Yeah.
for the post. Because it's brick, it would just basically completely destroy it. Um, you just crumble it. And it's like, why aren't these guys paying attention to where they're going? And it's just really, this is simple stuff. Like, guys just need to do better. So the first story is, I think, you a classic one of, this is a very human-centric system,
Mhm.
right? So these are, yeah, there's trucks and things like that, but like when the rubber meets the road, when the guy's there picking up the trash, it's him and the trash.
Mhm.
There's really not much else that's there, and so, really at the end of the day, these guys just need to do better, right? That's the story.
Yeah.
You start digging a little bit though, and we actually got the opportunity to do a lot of ride-alongs with them. So I got to spend basically a full shift with the crews, and you start to see things like just thinking of a guy driving down the road who has to stop at every home and pick up trash, usually with a hydraulic arm.
Mhm.
Sometimes he has to get out of the cab and manually lift it. And you start to think about the complexity of that work,
Mhm.
right? So where does he have to pay attention? And
Yeah.
it was all gentlemen at the time. I don't know if there's any
Yeah.
females working with them now, but like one guy I spent a lot of time with this guy named Gerald. Where does Gerald have to be looking? Well, if you think about it, he's got to be looking at least five different places at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? Like 'cause he's got to look to see that he stops at the proper location. If he's going to use that lift arm, it's got to stop. And what else is in that path? Well, cars, parked vehicles, and
Yeah.
mailboxes and things. So like this there has to be some level of precision there. He's also driving down a residential road, so you look for
It,
cars, you look for kids,
dogs. Yeah.
dog, all kinds of stuff. It's also these roads are often, and cars coming out of driveways. These these roads are often quite small, and so he's stopping at every street, to
Traffic.
or at every house. Yeah, there's cars behind him that are like, "Hey, I got to get to work." They're zooming past him, and so he actually has to go in and then out, and then in and then out, oftentimes to be able to get to where he needs to go. And that alone, just thinking of that alone, like that's amazingly complex. And yeah, the organization did things like, okay, let's install like a camera that they can look out and see if there's someone next to them. Come to find out, most of them didn't work,
Yeah.
and nobody knew about it, right? So these guys were just operating based off of feel.
Yeah.
Um, and they would do things, really interesting things that I found, like, because the organization actually incentivized rushing, even though they said these guys are going too fast, they need to slow down. They actually paid these guys, they call it the task system. They pay them for 8 hours of work, and uh, no matter what, no matter
Yeah.
how long it took you. So these guys would try to finish their route in 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, so that they could go home and pick up their kids from school and
Yeah.
things like that. So they were incentivized to rush, but there were times when they chose not to. And
Hmm.
that was really interesting. They would alter their routes and go in a less efficient way to avoid things like, oh, well, that school is going to get out in an hour, so we're going to go do this one first, so we avoid all those extra
Yeah.
kids and cars. And so, I mean, you start thinking of all these extra things that these people are doing thousands of times a day without incident, and you start to realize, hey, this is not a problem of these guys don't care enough.
Yeah.
This is a problem of them dealing with a complex work situation that I haven't even gotten to the full depth of it. And usually it works, but sometimes just the complexity overwhelms them, and
Mm.
eventually it's going to fail. So I don't know. What does that
That's
spark in
really cool.
you?
It absolutely. So it was interesting you started off by saying this is mundane. So the first episode I had Jason Coyle, who's a wildland firefighter based in Flagstaff. Ben knows him.
Hmm.
And one of the things, and he started off talking about logistics and finance and mapping around wildland firefighting. And I was
Hmm.
like, oh, I thought you were going to talk about some sharp end, when you're in the flames and you're chopping trees down. And he said, nah, this is, that's I'm going to say the relatively easy piece. It's things like managing contracts. How many contracts can an admin person deal with in a day? It's like, oh, okay. That's, it's not something considered. The mapping experience of the GIS guys and the quality and experience of these guys to be able to plot a map and see where things are going and then pass it on to the frontline operators. And if those mapping guys don't get it right, then the frontline operators are behind the curve all the time. And so they're always playing catch up. So these mundane things, it's really cool to understand
Yeah.
the reality of what goes on in work and what needs to occur. And it's one of the
Yeah.
things that I think we also often forget is the work that happens at the leadership and management level within organizations that we just, often we blame up. We sit there going, oh,
Yeah.
if only they could sort their lives out. And there's a workers imagine workers done, workers disclosed at that level too. And that I think is one of the easiest
Exactly.
ways to try and get these points across. It's like, so you as the HR director, do you follow all of your rules all of the time to the letter that's needed? No, I don't have enough time to do that. Or if you go into
Hmm.
the hiring side, Can you get a bum on a seat? Yes, tick, done, move on. So I have met my metric, which is what I'm being measured against, and we've got to get some people in. But what are the knock-on consequences of hiring somebody who appears on paper to match it, but we actually haven't spent the time to find out what they're supposed to do. So I think the mundane is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Diane Bond talked about the banality of accidents, banal accident theory, which I think is super interesting. And like as you were talking, one of the things we found that was really important for these drivers, I remember we were in because you also think these roads that are on are not always straight, right?
Yeah.
They're often curved. You have cul-de-sacs that are, very difficult to maneuver for a big piece of, equipment. And so this guy was like going into this really tight space. I remember it was Gerald actually at that time, and I was like, wow, I was really impressed with the level of expertise. And I'm like, how did you learn to do that?
Mm.
Like, 'cause he was able to get himself into a space. And so he looked at me and smiled and he said, I've hit a few things, which
That's
I
what I
thought
was
was
about to
funny.
say. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, I mean, alone is a really interesting paradox that the reason they didn't have an accident that day was because they had an accident a few days or went in sometime in the past, which what is, imagine saying that a part of our safety management strategy is to have some accidents so that we can not have them later, which,
And, and I
is
don't
super
know,
interesting.
you'll know who the author is. It might be Gert Gergenzer talking about risk, or it might be John Adams. And that bit of to know risk, you have to experience it, and you've got to know where the boundaries are. You know,
Yeah.
if you don't know where those boundaries are, and that's why, in effect, training systems, and we were talking a bit beforehand about sort of military training systems. That's why the training system has to create the environment where people can fail, they can make mistakes, but we've got those safety nets in place so that when people may get hurt, we've got first aid cover, we've got all of that stuff that allows them to fail safely so that when they're out in the real space, in the real world, they've got a better idea where the boundaries are.
And one of the things I found super interesting with that, like, so they learned the boundaries, but they learned the boundaries on that particular vehicle.
Mm,
And so, like, if you think about it, like you get in, your car, you kind of know how your car operates, turning radiuses, how the brakes perform, how much it accelerates. But then you get into a rental car or someone else's car, and there's always a little bit of jerkiness at first. You're not quite sure
yeah.
excuse me, how it goes. Which, back to your point about kind of like these blunt end systems that are affecting it. Well, there are times when their trucks break down. And so what do? Well, it's not like they're not going to operate that day. They get into some other truck,
Yeah.
which creates more risk because they don't know the operating envelope that they have to work in. When they have to get into those tight spaces, they don't know, hey, if I hit the gas this much, how far is it going to go? Am I going to hit that thing in front of me or not?
Yeah.
And
Where's
so
the
that
clutch biting point or whatever? Yeah.
their maintenance facility was they had a contractor that was managing it and they were super slow and like the operators would complain like, hey, if I put in for like a busted tail light, I could not have my truck for a week.
Yeah.
you know and like that has real world consequences for me, for them potentially hitting something or getting in an accident or and so just this really, again,
Yes.
mundane thing as maintenance contracts, just
Yeah.
having real world effects downstream.
Oh, so the when you were talking about the sort of the driving piece last week, I was in the Netherlands and I hired a car and I put a LinkedIn post about automations, and it's really interesting what you said about where the car is. I know, I believe I know where the front left corner of my car is when I come to turn into a tight junction. But I couldn't tell you. And actually, technology on modern cars now with the ultrasonic sensors are awesome. Sitting there, I believe you drive a Tesla. You drive a Tesla?
My wife does. I have a
So,
Volvo
so
because, of course,
having
I
the
do.
little distance measurements where the ultrasonics, as you coming around the corner, you're like, that's cool. But I don't know
Yeah.
where things are. So, last week I was driving this Mercedes with its automated stuff. I've been driving 35 years, and nearly all manual. But I'm quite happy driving on the other side of the road, happy driving an automatic. And in fact, the guy said, "Are you happy driving an automatic?" It's like, yeah, that's fine. It was a hybrid. So we get in the car and I knew it's a start stop button. So I pressed that. It's like, okay, it's a hybrid. It's now on battery. So I don't even know if it's started yet. So it's that bit of, I'll press the accelerator a bit. Oh, it moves, right? Okay, it's working. And then it's like, oh, teetering out the car park
Yeah.
and it just, you sit there. So, there's me, just me in a car size thing. But you get in a truck where you've got, I don't know, 35, 40 feet of length.
Oh
You,
yeah.
you've got, I don't know, 10, 15 tons of inertia to deal with. Do you know where the corners are? And, the road design guys, yes, build a cul-de-sac that allows us to put vehicles in here. What size vehicles? Oh, domestic vehicles, SUVs. Oh, yeah, we need to have a 40-foot refuse truck come in as well. Oh, okay. Right. Yeah, it can come in and out. Can it turn around? And so there's, you know, and then you wonder why.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's the real that the problem is that people see that as boring and mundane because you sit there going, oh, just follow it. It's, because we just want to simplify it
Yeah.
to follow the rules. But what if the
Yeah.
rules are not followable in the constraints
Exactly.
we're operating?
Because I think what you're describing too, and this reminds me of another aspect of it, of the work. But what you're describing is that expertise is, we often think of it as something embedded in the individual, but it's a connection between the individual and the situation, right?
Mm,
Like in the environment, their
contextual.
tools,
Yeah.
what's going on in that moment, right? So your expertise with your vehicle is related to your ability to judge, where the corners are, for example.
Yeah.
And an example in the work with these guys. So sometimes with the guys who had the hydraulic arm that would pick up the trash carts, sometimes there would be bags of trash that residents could put next to their trash carts. Well, those you couldn't pick up with the arm, so they would actually have to get out of their vehicle and manually put it into the back of the truck. Now, the organization had a policy. So, number one, you don't lift anything over 50 pounds. So it's about, what is that, 20
Yeah.
some
20, 20,
kilos.
yeah, 20 something kilos. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't lift anything over 50 pounds. And number two, when you do lift, you lift with, proper lifting techniques, close to your body, lift with your
Yeah.
knees, all that stuff. But but then you talk to the guys and they're like, okay, number one, what does a 50-pound trash bag look like?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like, how do I know by looking at it what's inside there? It could be feathers or
Yeah.
paper or bricks.
Yeah.
Like you
Oh,
don't know.
well, there
People
we go.
throw
There are
away all
bricks.
kinds of stuff.
And you
Yeah,
don't want to spill it all over the pavement because then you get in the dwang as the refuse guy.
exactly. Exactly. Right. And then number two, if proper lifting is you bring it close to your body and lift with your knees. Well, the problem if you bring it close to your body is what's in there? Things like
Nelly.
glass, chemicals, disgusting things. They've
Yeah.
literally had guys actually get cut from picking up these things just because like a piece of glass will come out and
Yeah.
slash them, or have syringes sometimes that poke them. Like, so there's real world hazards to doing it the safe way
Yeah.
that they know about. And so, the expert, their ability to be experts at lifting something is not helped by the situation. So just telling them to do it doesn't create the expertise. As a result, they've tried to come up with their own ways to judge, and their folk ways of judging, hey,
Yeah.
is this a safe bag to lift or not? Um, and it's a tough situation. Even the organization would say, oh, well, if they feel it's unsafe, they don't have to lift it. But the organization also has a policy that says, hey, it's I can't remember what they called it, but basically anytime a customer complains, no questions asked, they will come back and pick up the trash.
Yeah.
So the guys know, if I leave this trash, this customer's going to complain, and I'm going to have to drive back here all the way across town to come pick it up later. So why waste my time?
Yeah.
And so that expertise, they don't have the ability to create it because they don't get good feedback from their environment. And
Yeah.
so as a result, they're kind of creating it on the fly, which is a really brittle situation, a fragile toast, I say.
It's really, what I want to do with this podcast is bring these sort of hidden pieces out because all we see is that first story of, oh, Binman didn't pick the trash up again. Why? Or they spilt
Yep.
stuff, or they dinged a car, or whatever. And you just sit there and go, you know what? That is exploring where the boundaries are, both social and technical and physical, environmental, because we've got to know where those things are. And I think, did they ever say how they brought new guys on? Because that's always a challenge where people have
Really good
developed that
question.
tacit knowledge, that sort of, folk knowledge, the expertise, and you sit there go, yeah, it's one of those. You go, how do you know? Oh, because I don't know, it just looks right. So how did they do that knowledge transfer to help
Yeah.
build that expertise?
It's a really good question. So they did, they do training, but the driver training is on cars, which I found hilarious. Uh, so they have, yeah, they do the what they call the Smith system, which is a thing designed for cars, and they actually practice in cars to drive these big trucks, which is insane. But then they have a ride along system where, and I can't remember the exact amount of time, but it was like a week or 2 weeks where you actually ride along with a driver, and see how they do it, so you can learn the routes and learn the procedures. And so,
So I'm just thinking there is actually your optical perception because you're going to be sitting in a different seat. You're not going to be
Mhm.
sitting in the seat the driver is. So sorry I interrupt you there, but yeah, I can see.
No,
Hey,
100%.
hey, great, ride along. You can see everything that goes on, but actually the hard bit's going to be maneuvering the vehicle.
Absolutely. Well, and I also suspect that condition isn't really useful for helping people, because again, like if you're in a new person, you're not incentivized to ask dumb questions, right? A lot of the stuff that I got is because I don't really care. I like asking
Ah,
dumb
exactly.
questions.
Yeah.
But like the guys, when I asked them the questions, they often would have to reflect from it, because back to your point about tacit knowledge, they're not thinking to themselves, well, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to do that. They're just doing, because
Yeah.
it's all muscle memory at that point. Um, and so there's a lot of stuff that just would go unsaid. And so, and as a result, interestingly enough, because these drivers are often on their own, I was with three different drivers, did it in three very different ways. It was very, and so like, who knows if that
Yeah.
person sitting with that driver for that week is going to learn all the right ways or all the effective ways or all the, they're probably
Non-normative
not.
terms. Yeah.
Exactly. They're not probably going to, they're not going to know which questions to even ask. And B, just because they learn it from one driver doesn't mean that there are not other options that
Yeah.
they will be able to learn. It probably will learn by trial and error, but when you think about that in like a huge truck, there's a lot of possibility for bad things to happen. So it wasn't a very good system. And so that was one of the things we talked about, is, and kind of as a recommendation to them, was building processes for them to start, even with the experienced people, to share,
Story.
hey, how do you guys deal with this?
Yeah.
Tell me a story when you went into a cul-de-sac, and how did you maneuver that?
Yeah.
And just have them start sharing their ideas and adaptations that they've come up with. Yeah,
That's
for that
really,
reason.
yeah, absolutely. Your point about asking questions is is that classic one of, just speak up. Okay. What do I ask the question about? You should ask good questions. As a novice, go and ask people
Yeah,
questions about stuff. It's like, but I don't know the job and I don't
yeah,
know how to do it. So, I have to go out there and observe and listen, and just soak up what's going on, and then trying to think about how do I formulate that piece.
yeah,
But it's really easy from an organization. Again, we go back to that first story piece. Oh, you should have asked the question. You should have stopped the job. And that whole piece about, if I don't know that something is unsafe, how do I stop the job as a consequence?
yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah.
so
And well,
people
and
will
I
push
think
and
these guys,
explore
they
those
just thought it
boundaries.
was normal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's your point is so solid, because anything that seems obvious to us and from the outside, we should be very suspicious of,
Yeah,
because on the inside it's never that simple. It's never that easy. These guys, they didn't know to stop work or report any of the issues I talked about, because it was just their, I mean, again, they do this over 1,000 times a day,
yeah.
every day, and most times without incident. So is it unsafe? I guess, but like, again, they do it like 12,000 times a day, because there was about 12 operators that usually operating
Yeah.
on a given day with it without issue. So is it unsafe? I don't know. That's a tough question to ask, or to
Well,
answer.
it's
So
a really, really easy one to ask. Is that
yeah,
safe? I don't.
yeah,
And
yeah,
the traditional metrics of, well, we didn't have any injuries, we didn't have any collisions, we didn't have any fatalities. Yes, it's safe. And you sit there
yeah,
going, where are the eroding margins that are there? And do we even know what those margins look like? If
yeah,
people aren't, they're not tracking them because they're busy doing work, they might
yeah,
get back and go, oh, that was close. I had one of those today. And you might talk about it in a coffee. But if they're in that bit of, right, I'm going to finish job because I've got something else, there is
yeah.
no um, non-negotiable time that the organization provides that says, right, we will have a debrief, we will have a storytelling session, we'll have a reflection. Because I can pretty much guarantee out of those 12 operators, there will be at least one or two stories that will provide learning for people. Yeah, more.
Absolutely,
But, you sit there
absolutely.
and I think this echo actually just I love the way conversations go off and emerge and things. It ties in with a point yesterday where I talked about the Dutch railway systems. In 2017, they had a change of safety leadership and they started to take a more systems view of this. And, they get multiple incident reports each week from their drivers and their conductors about what was going on in the train system. And they used to just sort of categorize it and then throw it into an incident bucket. It wasn't a learning system, it was just a repository. And they when they took this on board and these new changes, they started to triage them based on learning opportunities. And that was one of the questions yesterday is if we get lots of reports into our reporting system, how do we decide which ones to deep dive or do a learning teams on or something like that? And there is no absolute, there's no objective judgment. You've just got to sit there based on what you perceive of the narrative. And what I said to them most importantly is what can you abstract out of that particular story into other places? Because the likelihood of that event, so in your case of hitting a brick post box with that vehicle and that driver, that's probably not going to happen again. But actually, what are the bits that we can go up and out and start looking at? And I
Yeah,
said that, that's a real subjective piece. And that means that your triages, for want of a better term, is that a term? I don't know. But
it
is that
is.
bit of those people who are doing that triage process need to be informed to understand how systems operate. So you can't, so again, we go into this sort of blunt end stuff. If they don't know what good looks like in terms of a learning story, they're going to end up picking the wrong ones out of the basket of incidents to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, and that's why I really like using a lot of mundane examples, because to me it shows like something I like a mantra in my head, and then I try to get across to people is that work is a problem that has to be solved every day,
Hmm.
right? Every day, work is messy, it's complex, it's never the same way twice. Most of the time, it's pretty close to what it was. Sometimes it's wildly different, and you never know which it's going to be before, right?
So
So
like parenting,
you,
really.
you exactly right. Like it's like so many other parts of life. And so as we're trying to figure out how I'm going to solve work, that's where variability really starts to rear its head, right? So as people adjust their performance to the variability of work, you get all these different things, and that can teach you a lot about how your system is functioning. Right. And I think that's the key point. Like we can look at this mundane example of guys just picking up trash and start to use pattern analysis when we go up to higher levels of abstraction about, hey, how do incentives and pressures interact to create the need for adaptation?
Hmm.
Right. So, like for example, the kind of customer service mindset that that organization had created a pressure to, okay, I need to figure out a way to pick up these trash bags. Right. I know I'm told I should leave them behind if I think it's too dangerous, but I also know that I'm going to have to probably come back and pick this up, and I don't want to stay too late because now there's also a pressure I need to move fast. Those pressures interact to create that adaptation. So you can, the point is, you can look at hey, these guys just aren't picking up their trash, trash bags, or they're not. I'm sorry, they're not reporting these trash bags, and they're just picking them up and going. You could look at that as a problem at the individual level,
Hmm.
but if you look at a higher level of abstraction, you start to see, no, this is an issue of pressures.
Mm.
Pressures interacting at a high level, creating conflicts and trade-offs that these guys now have to make. And we can criticize their choices all day long, but probably the
They have to
easiest way
make
to
them.
solve this problem, yeah, exactly. At the end of the day, the easiest way to solve the problem is support them making those trade-offs and reduce or managing those pressures, not just telling them to try harder next time, because that's not the solution.
No,
Um,
and as you were talking, I was thinking about how do you solve the problem differently? And you sit there and go, right, you might provide people more trash bins, or you give them strong, the garbage company or the whatever actually supplies the receptacles or the bags to the residents so that they are reinforced. And you sit there and go, yeah, but that costs us money. How much does it cost you to repair all of the damage that's caused because you're in those situations? But that's not
yeah,
my cost. It is when it goes wrong, and you have no way of controlling the likelihood of that going on. People are trying to do what's
yeah.
going, so
Yeah, that's and we had that exact conversation. So actually, because that those were actual recommendations that came out is like,
yeah,
hey, can we change some of the policies around the bags and things like that, or change the bags themselves, provide bags
yeah,
that and make it easier for people, for these guys to know what they're dealing with, or that are more reinforced or whatever. But that was the pushback, like, hey, no, that would push costs back onto the residents.
yeah.
And but I was like, well, the costs are there. But the hard part of the conversation, and this is, I think, something that you probably organizations want to bring to light, is that costs don't go away. Risk has to be managed. It's
Hmm.
just a function of where it's going to go.
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Like, and I think a lot of times we are very comfortable just like, oh, well, we can't deal with that, so we're just going to not do anything.
yeah,
And we think that that means nothing's happening, but that risk or that cost moves downstream. It moves down to the sharp end.
yeah,
And those workers had to manage it. They didn't have a choice. Right? At the end of the day, they're the ones who have to bear the cost, unfortunately. And yeah, some of that cost trickles back upstream in terms of maintenance and other things, but like the real human costs are being managed day to day.
yeah,
And so the question becomes not, do we want to bear that cost? The question is, where and when is the best place to manage that cost? Because it's going to be managed somewhere. And like,
yeah.
is that where we want it to be managed or not?
It reminds me, my last job in the Air Force was as a requirements manager, systems engineer, putting defensive aid systems on helicopters and transport aircraft. And it was this whole piece about making sure that you get your requirements nailed early on, because the cost of fixing them as they go through the system starts to just go exponential. And it's like, but we don't have enough time to do that now. We've got to get it done. It's like, okay, and all we do is just kick it over the fence to the next person and then wonder why the prices go up massively because the requirements definition sucked. And industry
Hmm.
exploited that because the way that the military awards contracts is often a roundabout, or public services in general, is what's the cheapest price that's out there. So if we underbid at a level that we think is acceptable, knowing that the military are going to change their requirements, we can just recover our costs on requirements change. And
Yeah,
so you sort of go, oh.
absolutely.
So and there's a history of this, so it's not like it's unknown that we have to deal with.
Yeah, everybody knows it's happening, but it takes effort to and understanding, I think, to change it, right? Because like you said, like, hey, this system is working as it is, the costs are being paid, it's fine. But like we can change it. Like it's not like we can't change it.
Yeah,
We're not helpless here.
yeah,
And I think a lot of times, and we had this conversation in this particular case with this organization, like leaders feel helpless, but then when you know, say, hey, actually, here's a whole slew of things that we can change, it kind of opens the door for them because oftentimes they part of the problem is they're looking at it very narrowly. Like the
yeah,
problem is, in your case, the problem is those contractors are bleeding us dry. Well, okay, but where is that coming from? Where are the incentives and pressures that are driving that, those
yeah,
behaviors and actions upstream? And maybe those are leverage points that we can get at. Um, I even had this conversation just the other day with a colleague of mine about, we were talking about an incident that happened at one of our job sites, and one of the part of the conversation was how the foreman in a construction context, or supervisor for people who aren't
mm,
familiar with the term, how they um, gave like a pre-job briefing to these individuals, and the conversation was, well, some foremen are really good at it, some foremen are not good at it, and he was like, well, how do you deal with that? Like, that variability. We can't control the foreman. And I was like, and so the thing I said is, yeah, you're right. We absolutely can't. We can't control who comes in and out the door. So that's a source of variability. So we have to assume then that our system needs to be designed for if we have a bad foreman,
yeah,
because we're going to have bad foremen sometimes,
yeah. We don't know. Yeah,
Um, how are we going to manage it for when a foreman has a bad day?
yeah.
You know what
Well,
I mean?
that's the
Like,
other way of doing it, because it's bad foreman, and because then the good foreman go, oh God, it's that person over there. That's why we've got to do this extra stuff. And you turn around and go, you're
exactly.
an excellent guy, but what's it like at 3 o'clock in the morning when it's raining, it's cold, you've been up all night beforehand because your kids have got a cold? Are you a good foreman now? Oh,
Exactly.
maybe not.
Yeah, it's all about, because at the end of the day, we're not going to fix everybody. And even if we, brought them up to, they cared a lot and were really smart, that doesn't mean they're not going to make
Make a
mistakes. Because
mistake.
like,
Yeah.
I'm pretty, I like to think I care a lot and I'm not stupid. Well, maybe I am, maybe bad example, but like, but like we all make those mistakes. And so if you design your system so that I need people to be perfect or else I'm going to have an accident, you have a system that's designed to have accidents.
Absolutely. If you require
What are you going to do
perfect
with that
performance,
fact?
yeah, yeah, totally. If you
Yeah.
require perfect performance to have a safe outcome, perfect performance of a single individual, they are your barrier. Eh, that's not going to happen. It's not going to.
Yeah.
And so
It's, yeah. How do you live with that? You know what I mean? Exactly. Yeah.
it's
Which is
really,
a tough nut to crack,
it is.
but
But I think, if we go back to the purpose of this is you've got to find those second stories. You've got to find the depth and the problem that people
yeah.
have. And as a consequence, if you're going to find that, you've got to create the social and cultural environment that when, a supervisor or a leader goes up to the guy and says, how do you do your job? That's done in a curious way as opposed to how do you do your job? And
Yeah.
the judgmental piece. Oh, you don't want to know, boss. All right, fine, cool. And you walk off. It's like, no, actually,
Yeah.
I do. Because I want to know if you're the expert, what can we learn from you? What are the challenges that are getting in the way of you being successful? And what is it that we can help? Oh, you can't change anything. Well, I don't know. Until you tell me what those things are, I can't do that. And that requires the organization to build time and build that mindset that says compliance only gets you so far in a complex space. So,
Absolutely. But I think, yeah, that the depth that you're talking about is really important. And, a lot of times people will say, hey, you're not going to be able to get to build that trust. And so I think sometimes we do ourselves a disservice with our auditing systems, which are very broad in scope, but not deep in scope.
yeah,
And I think that's a mistake. Like I think sometimes it would make sense to do a more of a vertical audit where we just let's just look deeply at this one
yeah,
task and just spend a lot of time talking to the people, going out with them, if you can, and it's safe to do so, maybe do some of the work with them. Like,
Yeah.
you know, it helps you see, and you're not going to know everything about that task, but you're going to build the trust, and people are going to start talking, and it just and then you can abstract that up to how your system is actually working, which probably affects all these other things that you didn't look at directly, but
Yeah.
still you got what you wanted.
And I think that, from my experience of being a consultant in this space, being an independent facilitator, you get told a whole much more stuff than, gets told
Oh yeah.
internally. And it's also one of the frustrations of, right, we'll tell you the story, Gareth, but you can't tell anybody else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
Then all right, fine, we'll work out a way around it. But it's really important when you sort of try and collect those, and yeah, it's really good. So thank
Absolutely.
you for those insights, and understanding, the boring side of work. It's I think people come on here and go, right, tell us all about this stuff. And you go, no, this is the stuff we can still learn from that. So what
Yeah.
would you recommend in terms of a book, a paper, a video to recommend to other people? And I can stick it in the show notes, for people
Yeah.
to start understanding these ideas.
Yeah. So two papers, both with a similar author, that pop into my head that I think are really drive home kind of the theme we're talking about, from Robert Weir's, Bob Weir's. They're
Hmm.
both in a healthcare space, but I think they're applicable. One is called The Tragedy of Adaptability,
Hmm.
and then the other one's called Precarious Success. And both of them are based upon the concepts we're talking about, which is humans are very adaptable, and they're so adaptable that they make our systems look better than they actually are, right? It makes it look like things are functioning fine, and it's just these bad people that are occasionally failing, when the reality is the humans are holding the damn thing together,
Yeah.
you know?
Especially in the healthcare
Uh,
space. I mean, that's such a powerful
exactly.
environment in that, and you're driven compassionately to make sure that the patients don't have any harm, and in the process that the workers are
Yeah.
sacrificing themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think all of it brings home a quote that I've seen in Eric Holnagel's email signature, that I've been thinking about lately, is that the difference between work is imagined and work is done is bigger than we can imagine.
Yeah.
Um, and like I'm just constantly reminded, like even me with this mindset, like I know that, yeah, there's a difference, there's a gap, but like almost every time I look, it's always surprising, it's always bigger, it's always deeper than I expected. Um, so I think those papers, I think, do a good job of driving home that point.
Cool. And actually that ties into one of my sort of favorite quotes from Dave Snowden at the moment, which is, you know more than you can say, and you can say more than you can write down. And I think that's a really difficult bit for organizations, because they want people to write stuff down in instant reports. And actually, that's just a fraction of what a conversation. We've had 40 odd minutes here. That's probably 6,000 words. That's 10 pages, 10 sides of letter A4. People are not going to read that as a conversation, but they probably listen to it, and they'll pick other things out.
Yeah.
And conversations are emergent. We had a bit of a plan to start with, and no plan survives first contact with the enemy, which is the real world. So, uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
so
Absolutely.
Ron, thank you very much for your time, and I hope to kind
Thank
of
you.
see you face to face again sometime soon. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I'd love that.